Welcome, Professor Neimeyer. And I'm really very happy to be able to talk with you for a few moments about the importance of grief in transitions.
I love the idea, Jakob.
Okay. I would like to ask you just a few questions and to hear your thoughts on that. And my first one would be, in what way does grief play a role when we look at the way in which people deal with transitions?
Well, of course, we realize when we slow down to think about it that ultimately we will lose everyone and everything we love over the course of our living. And by this point in our lives, most of us have already lost many and much. We will lose everything else that remains to us, at least in a tangible, earthly sense. And so I think the place to begin is with acknowledging the universality of loss and the naturalness of grief as the response to that loss. Really understanding grief as the entire set of not only emotional, but also the kind of cognitive, that is the ways we think about our lives and ourselves, how that may be changed fundamentally by the loss, the actions now that we must take in light of that loss to restore or rebuild a world of meaning that has been shaken or shattered by a sometimes traumatizing transition. So understanding just the centrality of loss to human life and the variety of ways that people respond to it probably is the place to begin the conversation, at least.
To begin, and then you say what is important is to recognize that it is both a fully emotional and a cognitive way of looking at it.
Yes, indeed. I use those words because our cultures use those words. But I think the fundamental human realities are not divided conveniently into boxes of emotions or feelings, cognitions or thoughts.
They come together.
They come together. They come packaged together at neurological, biological, and relational levels. So when we struggle to make sense of our life in the aftermath of loss, our child has died, our partner has committed suicide, our sibling was killed in a vehicular accident. This is not a cognitive process, nor is it merely a set of unwelcome emotions. It is an attempt to somehow wrap our heads and hearts around a brutal reality that separates us from a known and valued past and throws us into a world that is now alien and strange. And that is necessarily an experience that is deeply emotional and involves a quest to make sense, to find direction and significance in the life we now have. It implies a whole change in our repertory of actions, behaviors, our daily routines. And this is to say that it affects all of us. Grief then is something that happens inside us, but it also happens between us in relationship.
So it's an intrinsically social process as well.
Yes, very well said. I think of grieving, if we were to be a little more formal about it, I would see it as a kind of situated, interpretive, and communicative activity. It's situated because it always occurs within a relationship network, within a family, within a community, within a culture, within an historical period. It is interpretive because it has to do with making sense of what the heck has happened here. How do I explain it? How do I orient to it? What kind of future does it lead me toward now, if any? It's communicative because it unfolds not only within us in our inner dialogues with different parts of ourselves or inner conversations we have with the deceased, as we sometimes seek that person's counsel about how to go forward, drawing on their wisdom or inspiration for living. But it also involves, of course, intimate and non-intimate communications with others about our loss. who sometimes help us find a way to put one foot before the next and find a way forward. And so it is all of these things. And it is an activity. Grief is not simply a state. It's not just a noun. It is a verb. It is an action. And it has a kind of momentum that seeks change.
And could you also then say that in addressing the grief and dealing with the grief, it's a means of being able to stay inspired when you walk through life?
I love that idea. I doubt that many grieving people initially feel inspiration, but I think the quest for new inspiration, often in a way that draws on the legacy of their loved one, can give that new inspiration for life. That in many ways, as Tony Walter, a British sociologist, suggests, grief is a biographical emotion. That is, it is a way of seeking to honor and conserve and even extend the biography or life story of our loved one. And one way we do that is by taking inspiration from what we learned about living and about loving from them and implementing that, putting it to use in our life.
Learning is a vital aspect as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Learning the lessons of loss is part of the core curriculum of life.
In my experience, people sometimes find the word grief too strong for losses other than death. Do you recognize that, and what would be your stand on that?
Well, the language of loss is one that varies across cultures, across subcultures, across communities, across people, and finding a language that is adequate to describe our sense of emotional reorientation is appropriate. The same language will not be useful for everyone. I try to, in some way, in my conversations with people, move beyond the assumption that I know what they mean when they say, I'm in grief. And so I will ask questions that help reveal that. If they use the term, I might say, how does grief feel to you? And the person might say, well, it's like a burden. A burden. If that burden had a kind of shape or form, what might it be? It would be like a great rock or stone. And are you coming into contact with that stone or rock, or is it contacting you in some way? Well, it's over me. It's like I'm beneath it. And is it weighing on you or touching you? No, it's like it's hollowed out and I'm down there in the hollow part. Are there other people in this image? Yes, but they're all on the outside. Are they saying or doing anything to you from that place where you are? Yeah, they're telling me I need to get out from underneath it. Are you ready to get out from underneath it? No. No, it's like it's protecting me somehow. So in that simple kind of 2-minute conversation, we go past the public label to the deep personal meaning, right, that is often better conveyed in metaphor and imagery than in literal language.
So what comes to mind is that the ability for us as a counselor in dialogue, they are really very important, along with your curiosity to establish a common language between you.
Yeah, it is a question of a curious questioning. I think that is that's very well stated. It's a respectful, compassionate curiosity about a world of meaning that might be importantly different than our own, and that we should make as few assumptions as possible that assume that we understand what a person is saying. The ability to remain credulous, open, surprised by what we hear, and to ask the kinds of questions that allow people to be surprised by what they say.
And when you say you need to stay open as a counselor, you need to be able to be touched as well.
Yes, that's right. In fact, if I can't be touched by a person in pain, I really ought to go into accounting or something, right? Because we need to be informed by our emotional responses to our clients. Even the meaning of being informed suggests being formed in us, right, inside us. We look to be touched in important ways on the inside by what people are saying. And my clients bring grief in the form of tears, and I don't at least have moisture in my eyes. I ask myself, what's wrong with this picture, Bob? Why are you holding this at distance?
So there's a mirror from the client also towards you as a counselor.
Because I need to be able to mirror that person's reactions, in part to be able to take up residence in their world of feeling and meaning, and help them then map that world and find the routes that lead through it to new destinations. I can't do that at distance, from 10,000 meters up. I need to be closer to the landscape.
Would it be safe to then say that the gift the client gives you yourself as a byproduct is also getting to know yourself better?
Ooh, I love that idea. Absolutely. Because I think that in reflection of another's reality, there is also reflexivity on our own. That is, we are attending to what the other says as it sort of touches us. So it's a kind of from to knowing in which we are in the background as our client is in the foreground, and we're noticing the meaning of what they say in part by what it stirs in us, without making the assumption that how it stirs us is identical to how it stirs them. It's merely informative, but not necessarily definitive. We still require humility, kind of almost a cultural humility in coming to understand their culture, but also the culture of their personality, their family, in order to grasp the unique meaning of the words. You had asked earlier, too, the great question of, for some losses, non-death related losses, people might feel that grief was too strong a term. And I think that's fine if the people who are saying that are the people who have had those losses. And if they say, well, grief is too strong a term for what I'm feeling right now, what would be a term that would be just strong enough? I'd ask them. But if that's asked as a kind of critique, like, why is Jakob grieving? He just lost his job. It's not like he lost a person. Then I would push back against the presumption of someone else to know what grief is for you.
Because then the judgment stands in the way of your curiosity.
That's beautifully said. A judgment stands in the way of your curiosity. Judgment always stands in the way of curiosity, doesn't it?
Bob, can I ask you the question, when we're talking about major life transitions, what role do secure bases typically play during these transitions?
Well, they're the place where we still try to find a sense of home, aren't they? I mean, a place to come home to when the world has been made strange by loss. We come home to other people who provide for us a compassionate understanding, a willingness to listen, to hear what others will not, without rushing towards solutions that are premature. They may be places where we feel cared for and safe, familiar environments, even foods and so on that provide a sense of comfort and familiarity in strange times. All of these and more give us a sense that the world still cares for us and holds us and provides a kind of haven, right? A haven, a kind of harbor, a safe place when the seas of life become stormy. We can pull up into this harbor and take on provisions that we require and then prepare ourselves to sail out again into new destinations. So I think they play a really pivotal role in replenishing our resilience.
Yeah. So it's both about the harbor, being able to feel that there is a harbor, and also a way of finding ways out of the harbor when it's the right time.
Yeah. It's certainly not a one-way lock that you come through and the gate closes. The gate remains open, and we are able to set sail once more once we have repaired the vessel and put in new provisions, and we're ready to re-engage the onward journey.
Yeah. It's like a little bit of caring and a little bit of daring.
Ooh, that's very well said.
So when we're faced with transition, there is, of course, a lot of stories that we hear, a lot of stories that we tell. And oftentimes colleagues or maybe even our coach or our counselor will say, but that's not really exactly what happened. Now, is that really important? What is actually more important, the objective truth or the subjective truth?
Well, I'm a constructivist. I kind of think we construct or make it all up as we go along anyway. What we take for reality is certainly infinitely complicated and textured. We know that a primary function of the brain is to suppress signal detection, that is to sort of turn a blind eye to and avoid certain things, to put things out of awareness. So there's always much more there than we imagine. Stories in this way are always selective, even when they are true. And the stories then that we need to speak are the ones that need to be spoken, where people feel they need to give them words, they need to find an audience for them. It is their subjective realities filled with their subjective fears, maybe guilt, perhaps hope, perhaps fear, a whole composite of things that needs to be verbalized, witnessed, appreciated. And then we join people in reworking the stories in some way, not in a simple way of doing a positive reframe of a difficult experience, but in some way opening up the story to a deeper telling, to reveal the hidden bits, or to recover, for example, a sense of a loved one's life and what was valuable and beautiful in that, over against the ugliness of the story of death that may overshadow it, almost like a total eclipse of the deceased. Here we're kind of allowing that eclipse to pass and for the deceased to kind of come forward again visibly. So I really see narrative as, in a way, both the problem and the solution to the problem. The ugly and difficult story of the death or loss needs to be confronted and worked with in storied terms to allow a story of life to emerge from the story of loss.
Yeah, so if we interact on these themes, we establish a greater truth together, maybe.
I love that, as long as we keep the truth with a small t rather than a capital T, that it is a truth that will evolve. The truth that I had after my father's suicide when I was 12 years old is, of course, not the one that I carried into university at age 18, or the one that I had at age 35 when my wife gave birth to our first son, and I was flooded with a kind of sense of the preciousness of this young boy's life. The truth kept evolving as I did. And I think this is an important thing, to recognize that all of our stories are always being written as long as we're alive. And then they're being written and rewritten by those who live beyond us.
Yeah.
So they're never a static thing.
So truth is actually our life evolving.
I suppose we could say that the truth is transformation rather than static frozenness.
If we now look at the coaches and counselors working with grief or embarking on that journey of working with grief, what is in your view, the essential competency?
I would say three things. The 3 P's of practice: presence, process, and procedure. Presence is foundational. Being able to bring ourselves to the interaction, unguarded, vulnerable, open, acknowledging our not knowing, but having the courage to show up to whatever the client brings forward, however troubling or dark or perplexing it might be, to provide a kind of non-anxious presence to that story, coupled with a deep, compassionate curiosity to know that world with more clarity. Presence. That's the base of it all. Beyond that, an attunement to process, to the nuances of interaction with the other, being able to listen to what they tell us and how they tell it to us, to read the language of gesture and expression, to hear the way in which language is used, the pregnant pause that precedes something important, or the way in which a person might accentuate a certain phrase or use deeply figurative language that almost conjures an image of a wave of pain and might even be underscored with a wave-like gesture of the hands. We're listening with our ears, listening with our eyes. That attention to the process that unfolds between us, how we are touched by them, is the second most important thing.
Which is also a bodily experience.
It is a bodily experience. I'm feeling in me some version of what you are feeling in you. Not identical, but I am shaken and moved, and I tremble sometimes with the beauty of what my clients tell me. I often feel the emotion that rises in me now as some of those images come back. That's all part of the process. And then the third and arguably the least important thing are the specific procedures that we use. And that will depend on our theory, our preferences, our personality. What do we actually do with clients? Do we have them write a hello again letter to their loved one to reopen communication between themselves and a deceased person? Do we have them trace a lifeline with all of its ups and downs and put symbols on that lifeline to represent the time that they were dismissed from this job and the long period of searching before they found something more appropriate, or symbolizing a break in an important relationship? We have 1,000 tools that we can use and 1,000 more that we can invent. The procedures are useful, but only if they fit what the client needs and is ready for at a given moment of the process, and only if they are offered by a therapist who offers an unhurried, non-anxious presence to that process.
Yeah. So the technique is always at the service of the meaning reconstruction.
Yes, optimally. And so we have to be aware of the tyranny of technique, the way in which we can put last things first and first things last.
Yeah. Some people will possibly argue that finding meaning in the face of a meaningless loss is grotesque, is maybe even impossible, should not be asked or should not be looked for. What do you think about that?
I think it is a question of who the some people are, once more. If it is the person, him or herself, who says, I refuse to even consider the possibility that this hideous loss, this murder of my child, this suicide of my partner has meaning, I would join with them in the resistance to that too facile, too easy kind of meaning making, as if there's a justification for that or a divine kind of purpose in this, when there may be none. On the other hand, if that idea is voiced by someone outside the grief, that somehow the finding of meaning in that same child's death by the parent who comes then to give it a meaning, right? Maybe the meaning of this child's life, however brief it was to touch and inform others, or to awaken compassion in others for the illness that ended this child's life, or to pass on vital organs upon donation of that child's body to save other lives. I would not want the cynicism of the person who says there is no meaning to undercut those very beautiful acts of meaning discovered by that parent.
Yeah.
So I want to give priority to the griever in this regard. Ultimately, though, I would also say that even saying that a death has no meaning is, in a sense, giving it meaning. Mm. It is saying the meaning of life is that we live in a universe that is random, that has no justification. There's no kind of divine plan governing all of this. And to learn how to live and live well, maybe even to live nobly, in a universe where we do not have power or prediction to protect those we love, that can itself be a very meaningful quest.
Yeah, so that's about really the art of living.
Yeah, that's well said. It's the art of living.
Yeah.
And this requires some artistry in accepting the role of dying in that life.
Yeah. So when you look at working with clients that have been challenged by big losses, or even by small losses, clients that have been challenged by losses, how would you, as a therapist, as a coach, work with the balance of caring and daring?
I think I would begin with the caring. I think that that's fundamental. Oftentimes we become the client's surrogate, secure base. We are the safe haven, often in our offices, for a client whose world has in some way become dangerously unpredictable. And offering a kind of stable and, as I said, non-anxious presence may be very stabilizing for such a person. I will not be quick then to suggest that they need to be other than they are in that moment. I'm more concerned to understand than I am to push them towards something different. But ironically, I find that the more deeply I accept and come to know where they are, the more readily we discover the possibilities of change, even in a first or a third session, where people are ready for something. They may not be ready to relinquish their grief, of course, but they might be ready to take a step toward understanding the meaning of their loss, what it now requires of them, what would help that just a little bit. Maybe it would be the acknowledgement of this pain to their partner. Maybe it would be just a little more self-care. Maybe it would be joining that meditation class.
So do I hear you say then that without looking for it, entering into that deep, empathic dialogue might be daring in itself, without emphasizing it?
I rather like that. Of course, any time we move past kind of just mutely holding our mourning and grief to a place of being willing to take it out, acknowledge it, and put it on the table, and begin then with another to examine what's there, that is itself a daring act, because it means drawing close to something that we might rather avoid. So not all daring is action in the world. Often it's action in the self or in one's living relationships, even the living relationship with the dead. You know, dare I return to the house of memory and revisit scenes shared with my loved one? Dare I share on my phone photographs in response to the therapist's interest in seeing the loved one's image?
And does this therapist dare to ask for the picture?
Yeah.
At some stage. Would you like to show me that picture?
Yeah, that's right. And so I think just as you point out, the daring is something that happens on both sides, and it requires a kind of compassionate courage, I think, in both cases to say, this is a difficult thing we're doing here, but it's a thing worth doing, and I will do it with you.
I will do it with you. I will stand behind you.
Right.
Maybe one step behind.
Maybe one step behind.
I'm interested to hear from you, Bob, what organizations and their leaders might possibly learn from the field of grief therapy and the research on grief therapy.
One kind of lesson would be that some measure of grief probably occurs with or without that label or recognition in response to all losses. The losses of this account, the losses of this position, the loss of this employee, all of these will occasion some form of grief somewhere within the system. So being just attentive to that and being able to acknowledge that is important. Another kind of lesson is probably to recognize that there is a place for communal recognition and ritual. Workplace rituals that acknowledge transitions of the coming and going of employees. Of course, these would hardly be radical. We have retirement parties and so on. But do we have welcoming back gatherings when a traumatized employee who underwent surgery following a traffic accident returns to work 3 months later, partially healed? Do we have ways of recognizing her and rolling out the welcoming mat? So there are ways in which I think we might think about rituals of healing that allow people collective expression of concern and support.
Would it be safe to say then that transition without ritual is really difficult?
I think it is. We need to have a larger recognition of our own transitions and our pain. And that burden is lightened when it is shared by other hands. Oftentimes, for example, just anticipating the needs of a returning employee, in the example I gave, can allow his or her fellow employees to think about how could we make her reentry a little easier. Maybe she lost her child in that terrible accident as well. If we were her, would we want that child's name to be spoken? Would we invite stories of that child during the Christmas holidays or something when we're showing pictures of our own? What would this person want? I think that we can think about that in light of death-related losses. But even in other forms of transition or difficulties in workplaces, I imagine there is something to learn from the field of grief therapy. One lesson is probably that not everybody needs therapy. This is one lesson of grief therapy, that the majority of people are going to do just fine. People are resilient. Not everybody needs a coaching session or a therapy session, except when they do. And if we keep our eyes and ears open, we can kind of determine when that is the case.
So would that be important for leaders to have that eye open and to see what is needed?
I like that idea, and I hope that that's true.
Yeah.
That we might become better at the art of seeing, right, as well as the art of living.
Beautiful. Thank you for this conversation. And thank you for the wisdom that you were able to share and willing to share with us.
Well, hartelijk dank for this opportunity. It's been a great pleasure and an honor. And it's a fine thing to join the School voor Transitie in your attention to the many ways in which loss and transformation can shape our work and our lives.
Thank you so much for your warm words.
Iets te danken.
Thank you.